My life as an office administrator for the town steelworks had its charms, but I had lately taken to a spell of inferior and declining health, and it had been decided between my chaplain, myself, my doctor, and my employer that it would be best if I had a brief health rest, to spend some weeks or months by the sea to recollect my vigors and restore what illness had weathered of me. It was there, in that seemingly gregarious coastal village of Mabonport, with its long, overly long walks between its desolate yet at first charming parts, with its orange, leathern sunsets of evaporatory airs and various church towers and their respective enshrouding hills, that I began to experience a strange experience which was very unusual, and overall approaching the sublime, and yet I cannot quite say, at least not yet, as to what I mean, and more to the point, I was indeed trying to accomplish a true replenishment of the health. And so I may begin to tell you that I had checked in at the Mabonport Clinic of Health, Rest, and Wellness, in which individuals as myself might take the time to recover from the gusto of life otherwise, though in particular they gathered a great deal of dwindled New York businessmen and students from the universities whose academic rigors had reached a point at which their own beings had instead hurried towards the doors of St. Peter rather than those small and beloved office doors of Aquinas. I myself pondered over some texts of mathematics that I had brought from home, as to while away the hours between health rests and recuperative long walks. It was in those long recuperative walks that I began to explore the countryside, which seemed greatly preferable to my ailing vigors than the coastal air directly. While resting, my body and senses seemed to grapple most directly with the fatigue overwhelming them, and I could hardly confess that the health rests were anything overly pleasant. It was only in my long walks that I began to experience something similar to rest, and in that manner I found the health retreat so ardently recommended by the steelworks chaplain as being of great effect. I took then to the embattled health rests as a kind of necessary process, and felt that I should soon be the better of my fatigue. Yet it was on just one of those splendid walks that I had decided to penetrate more deeply into the country, and had passed through a vale whose low reaches had made that it passed beneath a vehicular bridge of some value to the county highway. But for any who persisted on the walking path through the vale, should find that in seemingly little time the presence of the highway and of the coast seemed to disappear all but entirely. Silos, wooden fences, and those imperious and cheerful barns of rustic keeping were what met the eye beyond the charming hills and wooded copses of that scenic little land. And it was on that day, the longest I had walked into the country inland of Mabonport, that I developed a kind of presentiment, a nervous and yet eager feeling of something imminent and vast. And though the hour I departed had been relatively early, a twilight had suddenly come on, and the dizzying nocturnal kingdom of the stars had begun to make its suggestions. I stopped in plain wonderment at my own condition. Had time really slipped away from me like that? A nervous stupor claimed me, and I feared I had gone too far from the healing airs of the coast and had worsened my condition, but more than that, I felt quite strangely that the time of day and my own health were deeply, if not intimately, tied in making my way towards what I knew to be a kind of scenic vista, an aperture in the hills of the country to reveal a magnificent promontory of rustic grandeur. Yet as I beheld it, a strange feeling overwhelmed me. The air over the farming vale and its vast and shoulderly plains seemed possessed of something within itself, of a nature belonging to its own logic only and none others. I began to feel very miserable, like a runny egg thrown at the glass face of a clock, which was a popular saying of my grandmother, who was Dutch. In the same immediacy of enthrallment that had seemingly swept me to this specular twilight promontory of sickened orange and purplish air, whose light seemed to veer towards its own purposes without respect for any of the rest of the world's typical logics, nor the steady hand of Apollo over his chariot, I had hastened away. Too immediately, too instantly had the impression of the glorious scene been impressed upon me. As I made my return into that low, linear vale, passing beneath the nocturnal headlamps of the rushing traffic, I feared that my health condition was sure to plummet. The doctor at the clinic scolded me for my late return, though he was generally only a little baffled and offered me a bourbon, which I declined. That night I dreamt terribly of that place, of its sky roiling like some acrylic enigma of a painting impresario, and I began to worry of myself. That morning I broke my fast very meekly, and I could tell I had taken a return of some degree to my previously unwell state. While in a deeper fatigue, I spent more time within the village proper of Mabenport, and took to speaking with some of the locals on the matters of the unusual country inland of the town. It was ironic, however, that various fishermen and restaurant and inn owners, as well as some ship captains of the laconic sort, had generally recommended my own doctor at the Mabenport Clinic of Health, Rest, and Wellness as the one to speak to of matters historic to the countryside of Mabenport, for he himself had come from a farming family who still lived in that region. When I broached the matter with the doctor in question, he took the matter with a secretive, dignified sort of air, and pleasantly suggested that it was probably an inferior realm for my health, that the airs of the farming land here were prone to sudden and sickness-bearing streaks of strong wind, and the attention of unwelcome insect life and unusual heat spells. I thought it surprising that it should be so different from the acclaimed and wholesome air of coastal Mabenport, and he vouchsafed a similar sentiment. I must confess, reader, that I could not quite bring myself to ask him of that strange overlook I had discovered, of the sudden lapse of time from afternoon to dusk, or of what suggestions the sky and endless-seeming field made upon my state of mind. In fact, contrary to the doctor's importations, I began to feel a growing desire to return, to see it again. After some additional days of limited walks, long sits by the sea, and the always engaging, somewhat bellicose health rests, I had decided amongst myself that I would make the journey once more and go into that place in the country and look. I thought for certain it would break the spell of fatigue over me, and that I should be better to affidavit my own certitude, to dispel that unusual evening's discovery of its effect upon me. I began again the long, generally very pleasant walking journey out of Mabenport, down through the low vale, beneath the vehicular bridge, and again into that country realm in which the clinic doctor purportedly spent his youth. I had left at an even earlier hour this day than the one previous, and was determined to see the overlook plainly. As I drew near, I confess that a similar presentiment began to form again. There was a sensation among the trees as the hills became very cloistered together before the sudden, almost abyssal exposure of the promontory. I was excited after all. I realized I was very excited. I walked faster and faster until suddenly a figure came before me. We all but ran into each other. It was some old man, a very tall, rustic sort of old man, a principal agrarian figure if ever one might see one. "You come this way for what?" he rumbled. It was at that moment that I became somewhat perplexed. I could understand that in my germain attire I might look out of place to the man. I could understand his accosting me. Yet, more than any manners in my possession, I wanted to see the promontory again, and could not forgive myself for playing along with the old agrarian, whose witticisms may have been profound, or whose imposture might perhaps have been severe. I had absconded care for personal entanglement or relation. I could not accept my moment of revelation molested by this pretender to the throne of my understanding. I ignored him. I walked past him, and he seemed to care little. It was then that I saw it again, and again I experienced a kind of stricken feeling. The time of day had not, this time, failed me. Rather, it seemed the blue of the lightening day was pinched over the rolling fields, and there was a feeling of malady to the wind, which seemed to gather sonically through some rampart or gully of trees, and yet the branches seemed to shake little. I could not admit that my health was in any way resolved by my return to that place, and yet its effect only seemed the stronger. After several more weeks, my health did in fact improve, and I was able to return to my administrative work in the office of the steelworks. But I should never forget how strange and sublime that place in the country, how it seemed to play tricks on what I perceived, and how overall unusual it was. Even now, I wonder of what light or faints of man that place would accept, and if it should appear to me again, if my own sanity would be ready to accept what its empty, curling fields would tell of me.